So it's a great pleasure to welcome all of our guests to this webinar. This is part of a series that's co-sponsored with ChinaSource and the United States Catholic China Association. Let me give a little advertisement for our U.S. Catholic China Association's upcoming international conference, which will be held in August 2nd to August 4th on the campus of DePaul University in Chicago. You can go on our website, U.S. Catholic China Association, and get more information about it. It's the 35th anniversary of the founding of our association, and information about how to register. And I think it's going to be a very, very exciting conference. But for today, I'm just excited and honored to present Professor José Casanova, who is one of the most distinguished sociologists of religion in the United States, and indeed in the world. Professor Casanova is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. He has a master's degree in theology from the University of Innsbruck and a PhD in sociology from the New School for Social Research, where he served as a professor before he came to Georgetown. His book, Public Religions in the Modern World, published in 1994, is considered a modern classic and has been translated into many languages. And he has many other books as well. Too many to go into right now. Otherwise, won't be any time for his talk. This lecture on the three phases of the globalization of Catholicism in Asia, with a special focus on developments in China, is part of an extremely ambitious, extensive project that he carried out together with the distinguished theologian Peter Phan on Asia-Pacific Catholicism and Globalization, published by Georgetown Press just last year. This is a monumental work that brought together 13 scholars, experts in the different regions of Asia, and recounted both historically and with theological reflection on the way in which the Roman Catholic Church globalized from the 16th century on, but in three phases, and in ways that affected Asia, but also affected the world church, because what happened to the societies in Asia has fed back into the way in which societies, the way in which the Catholic Church understands its mission and its faith. So Professor Casanova will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions. Some questions have already been submitted, but if you have other questions, you're very, very free to encourage to post them in the chat function here, and we'll try to give room to answer those questions for about 30 minutes after Professor Casanova finishes his talk. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Casanova, and we look forward to hearing his lecture.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Madsen, for the kind introduction. And especially, I would like to start by expressing my gratitude, first of all, to you for the invitation, and to Mr. Doyle. Particularly, it's a great honor for me to have been asked to present this lecture at the 35th anniversary of the U.S. China Catholic Association. The more so since I cannot claim any expertise on China myself. I am what could be called a generalist, a sociologist of religion interested in the interconnections between the transformations of the world church, global Catholicism, and global historical processes. I started being interested in China because I became interested in the Jesuits and the role they play as pioneer globalizers. This was a book, another project that I directed, and as a sequel to the first project on the Jesuits and globalization, we realized the importance of Asian Catholicism precisely as a point of entry to understand different phases of globalization. And so this is how the second project that Professor Madsen has mentioned came about. Now, the main idea that I want to present today is that the development of Catholicism in Asia is intimately related with process of globalization, and that both to understand the development of Catholicism through globalization in Asia and vice versa, understanding globalization in Asia through the developments of Catholicism there, give a special insight into both processes. I'm going to use a very broad conception of globalization. By it, I mean simply the increasing connectivity of all the peoples and cultures of the world. This is, if you wish, the objective dimension of globalization, can be measured. How much connectivity is uneven in some regions, in some people, in some groups, is higher than in others, and it changes through time. And the subjective dimension of increasing global consciousness, namely the consciousness of global humanity to become one single humanity in an enclosed globe. So in this respect, when talking of globalization, one needs to pay equal attention to the objective dimension of increasing connectivity and the subjective reflexive dimension of increasing global consciousness. Through its missionary expansion and rootedness in peoples and cultures throughout the globe, the Catholic Church has contributed significantly, at least since the 16th century, to global connectivity, while at the same time having also transformed the Church's own Catholic global consciousness. Prior to the 16th century age of discovery, of course, one can talk of proto-globalizations or archaic globalizations, namely increasing connectivity between different regions of the world. But this was not yet a global process. Literally speaking, when we talk of globalization and global connectivity, when the globe becomes a reality. And the globe became a reality in the 16th century, when it became possible to circumnavigate the Earth and also to represent the Earth as a globe that represented this reality and therefore could enter human consciousness. Now we could talk about the many different religious orders that participated in what can be called the golden age of global Catholic missions, which indeed are connected with the first globalization. But of all religious orders, although they came relatively late, the most important, the one that played a crucial role, were the Jesuits. They only emerged in 1540, if you wish, already 40 years after the discoveries, or 40, almost 50 years, and yet very soon they became, probably one could say, the best organized and perhaps the first organized group in history, in human history, to think and to act globally. I'm going to refer to three phases of globalization. The first phase, from the 1500s to the 1770s, this is what is called the first globalization. This is the age when the cultures of Asia and religions of Asia enter into contact with the culture of Europe and the religions with Christianity, and precisely Christian missions play a crucial role as brokers, as interlocutors in these cultural exchanges between Asia and Europe. And of the many missionary orders, none played such an important role as the Jesuits. This could be said was globalization before Western hegemony. Insofar as in Asia at least, during this phase, none of the Western powers were in a position to subjugate the big Asian powers. None of the empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Mughal Empire, the Chinese Empire, nor none of the main kingdoms and societies, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. So in this respect, other than in the Philippines and small Portuguese colonies, this was a phase of encounters before Western hegemony in the region. The second phase is what it could be called the modern phase of Western hegemonic globalization that begins roughly in the 1780s, when you could talk of the formation of the modern world with the French revolutions, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, which begins a new process of colonial exchanges, but now really the colonial hegemony of the Western colonial hegemony of the entire world. And this again a phase in which religion may not play such an important role as in the first phase, but nonetheless, it is significant. And then finally, so in the second phase from the 1780s to the 1960s, I say the 1960s because from the point of view of the global Catholic Church, it is Vatican II that is the turning point in the consciousness of globalization being a sign of the times, that we are entering a new age of global humanity characterized precisely by increasing connectivity and by the fact that we all have to live together and collaborate to solve the common challenges. So let me briefly just say a few words about the Jesuits, why they were so important. It's clear that from the 1550s to the mid 18th century, for 200 years, no other group played such a role as cultural brokers. They were as scientists, ethnographers, cartographers, botanists, natural scientists, astronomers, but also, of course, as linguists, as the writers of catechisms in practically every vernacular language in the world, as translators, and basically as cultural interlocutors between the cultures of Asia, East and West, and between North and South. Now, why was it so? Obviously, there were external possibilities that were not only open to the Jesuits, but also to other groups and to other religious orders. Those were first the Iberian colonial expansion that begins the age of discovery, the discovery of the West Indies by the Spanish Empire and of the East Indies by the Portuguese Empire. For Asia, the Portuguese Empire became the most important one. Spain, only the Philippines was part of the Spanish Empire. Otherwise, it was the Portuguese patronage system of the Padroado that really was the sponsor of the Jesuit missions in Asia. But although they came to Asia with the conquistadores, namely with the Portuguese ships, they came to Goa, to Macau, to Nagasaki with the Portuguese, but then they went further alone without the help of the Portuguese. From Goa, they went to Madurai, and there they have missions in which Westerners, soldiers, and merchants didn't have access. The same goes for to Macau, the Portuguese came, but to mainland China, and especially to Beijing, the Jesuits went alone without any other accompaniment. The same goes for to Nagasaki, they came with the Portuguese, but to Kyoto, to Tokyo, the Jesuits went alone. And they went without power, and they entered into cultural exchanges, into encounters in which they developed a particular way of proceeding, which is called accommodation and enculturation, in which first they became, if you wish, Japanese and Chinese became enculturated before they could bring Christianity to, you could say, the natives. They became natives themselves before Christianity could go native. In this respect, they had a sense that, and this is what the particular recommendation of Balignano, the director of the Jesuit missions all over Asia, that our task, they say, is not to Portugalize the Japanese or the Chinese, but to make the gospel Chinese, namely to evangelize in their own culture, in their own language. And for this, they had the model of a Jewish religion, Christianity being born as a Jewish religion that became, went beyond Judaism as Latin and as Greek Hellenic culture. So from the beginning, Christianity took two very different forms, the Greek Hellenic form and the Latin Roman form. And their idea was that if Christianity is a universal religion, can only be because it's not a particular religion linked to European culture, but can only become universal by becoming culturated, by becoming incarnated in each culture, in each particular culture. And this is what gave them the particular way of proceeding that explains why they are the main interlocutors. Think of Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci not only brought European culture to China, translator of Euclid's Principles of Geometry, translator of the famous aphorisms and friendship, the catechism, the Christian catechism in Chinese, but also the great Chinese world map, namely a cartography that was the synthesis of Chinese cartography and Western cartography. But he also became such a Confucian scholar himself that became a main interpreter of Confucianism to the Chinese, challenging interpretations of Confucianism, and to a certain extent then transmitting the greatness of Confucian culture to European culture. But the same could be said about Balignano in Japan, or the Nobili in India, or Alexandro de Rhodes in Vietnam, or Ippolito Desideri in Tibet. They are the pioneer first Western experts on each of these cultures, and they are the foundation of the Western understanding of these cultures and religions. Now, the mission that was at first very successful, very soon, however, came to trouble. Perhaps the most successful of them all was the mission in Japan, but there it came to a drastic end when the Tokugawa decided to expel the Jesuits and prohibit Christianity. Not because they were incompatible, because de facto Japan had proven how open Japanese culture was to every form of Christian culture, of Christian traditions. The large number of conversions from the highest social groups to the lowest. And yet it was not enough to prohibit Christianity. It was necessary to, if you wish, re-educate all the Christian Japanese back into Japanese culture. So one could say that actually the almost opposition between Christianity and Japanese culture was not something that was there at the beginning, but only became later once the conflicts have developed. The same you could say about the relation of Confucian Christianity, the way in which Confucianism and Christianity have found a synthesis that led to the Chinese rites. But the Chinese rites, of course, led to controversy both within the Jesuits themselves and also with other religious orders. And eventually, of course, to the conflict between the court in Beijing, the Emperor Kangxi, that supported the Chinese rites, and the kind of Christianity in the way in which Ricci had taught Christianity in Chinese. And of course, the Vatican, especially after Propaganda Fide, had tried to transform the global missions and gain control of them, but also in the Sorbonne, where the philosophers were thinking that they were universalists, that the Jesuits had compromised the universality of the Christian message. We know that the Kangxi Emperor had already decree the Edict of Toleration about precisely 100 years after the entrance of Ritchie in Beijing. But 30 years later, he was the one who prohibited the preaching of Christianity in China, the Chinese missions, in reaction to the rejection by the Vatican of the Chinese rites. This eventually would lead to internal conflicts between the Jesuits and the papacy, and then also with all the monarchs that had supported the Jesuits at the beginning, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish kings, and eventually led to the suppression of the Jesuits. The suppression in 1773, one could say, marked the symbolic end of this first phase of globalization, which was so much saved by the Jesuits. Shortly thereafter, about 10 years later, you have the American Revolution, then the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of what the great global historian Bailey has called the birth of the modern world. Now, as a world which is one single world system with a hegemonic center in the West and then the colonial peripheries. And this is now, of course, the phase when the West becomes the hegemonic colonizers in all of Asia. It is by the middle of the century that with the unequal treaties in which basically the Western powers, the British, the French, and the others force the Japanese, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Koreans to open up their countries to free trade, but also to the influence of the Western powers, and especially to the preaching to freedom of religion and to the protection of Western missionaries. Western missionaries, which in the second phase of globalization, really, the most important ones are the Protestants. If the first phase of globalization was the golden age of global Catholic missions, and very few Protestant missions anywhere in the world prior to the 18th century, from the 18th century on up to the middle of the 19th century, excuse me, the 20th century, you have the golden age of global Protestant missions. But also a revival of Catholic missions now protected and promoted by France as the Catholic colonial power in Asia. France would use the persecution of Catholic missionaries in Vietnam, in China, in Korea, as a pretext to intervene militarily in each of these countries. In the case of Indochina, of course, outright colonization. In the others, basically the kind of colonial protectorates that gave special privileges to the Western powers. So in this respect, the second phase of globalization in Asia is much more linked to colonial inequality and to colonial subjugation of the Asian peoples. The beginning of the change takes place around the 1920, you could say. The Fourth May movement is a turning point. From then on, you have a transformation, a change in missiology, both Protestant and Catholic, and the beginning of a process of enculturation, indigenization of the ministry, especially of the higher bishops. Here there was a Lazarist Belgian bishop, Frederick Leb, who was a great advisor to Pope Benedict XV in writing Maximum Illud. Maximum Illud was the encyclical of Benedict XV in 1919, basically now changing or promoting the indigenization of all the Catholic churches throughout what had been colonies, the decolonization, if you wish, of the Catholic Church, and the promotion of indigenous both priests and bishops. The process will first be resisted, but process of decolonization everywhere will advance the process, which comes to full fruition in Vatican II, and after Vatican II, with the formation of the Confederation of Asian Conferences of Catholic Bishops in 1972, in which once again you have the process of inculturation of Christianity, indigenization, if you wish, a recovery of the missiology first promoted by the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century. Let me just quote you from the formation of the Asian Conference of Bishops. Let me find, I had here somewhere the quote. Just a moment. Sorry, I thought I had it here. I cannot have seen very well. Here is a quote. We see the face of an Asia at long last coming to birth as a true community of peoples. For barriers which have so long isolated our nation from one another are falling one by one, and the desire grows among us to know each other and to find each other as Asian sister nations, among whom relationships of friendship and trust, of collaboration, sharing, and genuine solidarity may be firmly, lastingly wrought. What we see here is the experience of Vatican II, when for the first time, bishops from all over Asia came together in Rome and met personally and came to know each other. Bishops from different parts of Asia that developed the conscience of being a continental church. And out of this experience, the same way that happened with the 600 bishops from Latin America, the trials at Vatican II led to the formation of Selam and Medellin, that was the formation of the Pan-Latin American Church. Similarly, you have this process of confederation of national conference of bishops into this Pan-Asian Conference of Bishops. And so, paradoxically, a religion which is a minority in Asia and probably will remain a minority for the foreseeable future, nonetheless is the one that assumes the kind of consciousness of being a Pan-Asian religion, linking the cultures, the religions, and the peoples of Asia. And in this respect, it is also a consciousness of the Catholicity of the global Catholic Church and how this Catholicity is lived precisely in the in our contemporary phase of globalization. This is a new age of globalization in which we are much more aware. Global connectivity has become obviously multiplied at the nth degree by the new technologies, the new digital media, and by all kinds of new artificial intelligence, and of course by the increasing commerce, development of an integrated world capitalist system, the formation of a world system of nation states in the United Nations. All of it has contributed to this both increasing global connectivity and increasing global consciousness. And the Catholic Church, once again, one could say, is to a certain extent at the forefront of this awareness of the challenges facing global humanity and how global humanity has to come together precisely to be able to answer those challenges. It is precisely our contemporary Pope Francis is the one that most explicitly has talked of the need to move from a globalization of indifference to a globalization of fraternity. His encyclical Fratelli Tutti is precisely this call to unite for humanity, to unite all the religions, all cultures, and especially here is a encyclical in which the Pope quotes profusely from the Quran and from Muslim sources, and that shows this awareness of the global Catholic Church and the role it ought to play in globalization. Let me finish. Actually, it's not only Pope Francis, of course, that has developed this idea. This idea has been at the center of every papacy: John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul II, and Benedict the 16th. All of them equally express this idea of the role of the Catholic Church in global fraternization. Let me quote from Pope Benedict the 16th in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate. The Church has a public role over and above her charitable and educational activities. She works for the advancement of humanity and universal fraternity. It is this, I think, that is part of the unique role of global Catholicism, a minority religion in Asia, but that nonetheless plays I would say, a very clear role in this transnational pan-Asian consciousness of being together in the same boat and having to together in solidarity, particularly in solidarity with the victims of globalization, with the poorest, and also in solidarity with other religions and cultures, precisely to advance this human global fraternization. With these words, I would like to end my presentation, and I am open to questions and questions from, I think that from the chat we already have several questions, but you may be willing to add other questions. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Casanova. Once again, it's an advertisement for your book. It's a very, very important book. And I really recommend that people who are interested in Asia and are interested in China, because you can't understand Chinese Catholicism outside the context of all these developments in Asia and this globalization that you mentioned. So there are some questions that were presented beforehand by people who registered and sent them in. Let me just ask at least a couple of them, and then we can turn to the chat, and we'll see how far we can go in answering some of those. Here's one. As a former Jesuit brother of 22 years and a theologian, how does Matteo Ricci in China and De Nobili in India affect the great schism in the church and separation of East and West in ecclesiology, medicine, politics, metaphysics, Christology, and potential war? This is an easy question for you, Professor.
Right.
Maybe you can just.
I mean, actually, one could say, I mean, I have my own thesis is that this schism is a result of the failure or of the rejection of the Chinese rights. That it is this that led them to what appears to be a schism, a complete opposition between Chinese culture and Western culture. And this has led to interpretations precisely by somebody like Jacques Vernet, the great French scholar, that precisely the incompatibility of Christianity and Chinese culture, that the people, even the people that became Christians, had no idea of what Christianity was. And I think it's a wrong interpretation, that actually it shows the development of Confucian Christianity, or Christian Confucianism, whatever you want to call it, holds the possibility of a synthesis. And the fact that when it comes to Korea, it was not Christian missionaries, but it was Korean Confucian scholars coming to Beijing to pay tribute to the emperor, the ones that became Christian Confucians in Beijing and then brought Christianity to China. Eventually, Christianity will be also severely persecuted in Korea. But in all three cases, the persecutions came after very, I would say, successful synthesis and successful encounters that had, to a certain extent, built bridges between what appear to be opposite cultures. So I would argue the opposition between East and West is really a result of the encounter that becomes later transformed by colonialism into an opposition, because when in the second phase of globalization, when the West comes back to China, so in the first phase, look, all of Europe had a great interest in China. Chinese culture was the craze, Confucianism, the great thinkers, Leibniz, Voltaire, Montesquieu, all of them were fascinated by Chinese culture. It was only later, by the 19th century, that Chinese culture is viewed as primitive and Western culture as high civilization. And so now the fusion of the higher military, economic, political power of the West is translated also into the notion of a higher civilization. When one could say that the Chinese, let's say the Jesuit missionaries in China and Japan, they were great Renaissance scholars themselves, Italians that were basically children of the Renaissance culture of Italy, the highest form of culture in 16th century Europe. And yet they were convinced, of course, of the superiority of Christianity, but not of the superiority of Western culture over Chinese or Japanese culture. So this comes later. So we need to rethink those issues again today, precisely to avoid these absolute contrapositions. There were not that they solved the problem. The Jesuits also had difficulties with many of the fundamentals, if you wish, metaphysical, anthropological principles of Asian cultures, like the transmigration of souls, reincarnation, etc., because ultimately behind it there is a fundamental different conception of the person, of personhood, of the soul, etc. But nonetheless, there was a much greater dialogue in the first phase of globalization. And the hope is that today, I mean, after all, even the Chinese regime today, the most one, the less open to, if you wish, dialogue with the West, still thinks that Ricci is the model of the encounter between Western and Chinese culture. A few years ago in Hong Kong, they developed this huge musical on Matteo Ricci, pointing to the extent to which Matteo Ricci remains a fundamental symbol of what the dialogue between Western and Eastern culture could be.
Here's one other question about a theological one that's also cultural. Does the historical evidence of incarnation and resurrection pose some unique problems for sociologists? Or maybe we could say, does it pose some problems in enculturation of,
Well, yes, exactly. So it's not for sociology. Obviously, sociologists, individuals may believe or not believe in the incarnation. Those are basically acts of faith. Those are, if you wish, principles of Christian faith that cannot be proven empirically by science. Sociology can say no word for or against the incarnation resurrection. The question, of course, was to which extent those things that were from the beginning, as St. Paul said, the resurrection is a scandal for the Greeks, and it was a scandal for the Chinese. The fact that Jesus was crucified convicted and died as a convicted crucified person, of course, was totally beyond the possibility of, would seem, Chinese culture to accept it. But this only can be accepted as a principle of faith, not as an empirical event. So in this respect, I don't think that it presents more difficulties to Chinese culture than to modern empiricism, scientific empiricism. In the West, people also would reject precisely deism. In the 18th century, rejected precisely the theism of the supernatural revelation because those acts of faith were incompatible with modern empiricism.
I'm trying to look at the chat and see what other questions have been coming in, but I'm a little bit.
Here, I mean, there is a question on to which extent can Catholicism in China be characterized as an invasion, as Mungelo's book suggests. I'm not sure to which book is referred. Mungelo has several books. I don't remember that any of them he characterizes the coming of Christianity to China as an invasion. Certainly, it will be invasion of ideas, not invasion in the sense of a military or a political invasion. And of course, ideas, if you do not accept the fact that ideas can travel from one culture to another, then of course it's the end of the possibility of great cultures, right? The Chinese empire himself only became China through invasion of the neighboring cultures. And every great civilization has grown in this form by incorporating neighboring cultures. So at which point should we say that we should stop history and go back to the radical separation of each culture from one another? The question is whether these exchange of ideas, whether these cultural encounters happen as equals without force and without, if you wish, any form of coercion or power, or actually as a form of equal encounter. And I think that actually the way precisely Christianity first entered, if we look through the Novili with the Brahmins, the way in which he became a Brahmin himself before the Brahmins could enter into understanding Christianity, or before Ricci became accepted the habitus of a Confucian scholar, or the Sideri became a Tibetan monk, and so on. So they themselves became enculturated, assumed, became, if you wish, incarnated in these cultures, so that then those cultures could receive the gospel in an indigenous form. It's a complex issue that has not resolved today. As you know, there is a lot of discussions about missiology today. A lot of people think that proselytizing is out of the question, that today is only accompaniment, being together in dialogue with one another and respecting each other cultures and each other religions. So in this respect, the Catholic Church has advanced tremendously since Vatican II with the declaration of the individual right of religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, based on the dignity of the human person, and in Nostra Aetate, our age, which is basically described as an age of global religious pluralism, as a sign of the times. The fact that the Catholic Church has to enter into dialogue with all the religions of the world. So in this respect, I think that originally the Jesuits at least pioneered a form of cultural encounter, not based on imposition, but on genuine dialogue, I would say. Obviously not everybody, and there were always misunderstandings, and every dialogue may also falter, but nonetheless it was relatively successful versus the models of the 19th century in which Western hegemony really wanted to impose Christianity upon foreign cultures, but it was not very successful, this form of Christianity. Today, as we know, Christianity is growing in China, not as invasion, but because it has become indigenous. Protestant Pentecostalism is the one which is expanding Chinese Christianity from below, not through Western missionaries, but precisely through indigenous transformation of Chinese popular culture.
Maybe I'll throw in a question just in connection with this. What connection does the collapse of Christendom have to this? So through secularization. So now Europe used, when its culture was Catholic, but now that's gone. Even in so-called Catholic countries like France, for example, and it's secular. So the church is always is a minority religion, and its participation is voluntary, basically. And this affects missiology and its connection with Asia, where actually the situation is somewhat similar to a post-Christian church.
Right. This is true, but I would argue also that while Vatican II originally was promoted by Western theologians that were responding to this crisis of Christendom and to the need to enter into dialogue with secular modernity and with liberalism, eventually it was all the bishops of the world, from all of Asia, from all of Africa, from all of Latin America, that were the ones that gave the majority to all these final documents of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, Dignitatis Humanae, Nostra Aetate. All of them were passed with the same number, about 97% unanimous, 97% voted for it, what means that the entire non-Western world voted for it, and only 3%, basically Italian and Spanish bishops, were the ones that voted against it. So in this respect, it was, of course, Asian bishops know that Christendom had no future whatsoever, had no possibility. It was totally unimaginable in Asia. The same was for Africa or for Latin America. We see how Latin America, that had been a hegemonic Catholic continent, precisely after Vatican II and after the Catholic Church introduced a kind of voluntary disestablishment, if you wish, they themselves abandon Christendom, is what allows the possibility of a Protestant revival to work with a Catholic revival. And today, Latin America is one of the most pluralistic, religious pluralistic regions of the world. So again, in this respect, the transformation is one that is complexly into process of globalization, not only to the secularization of the West, but also to the fact that the indigenization, the post-colonial transformation of the churches in non-Western regions has led also to process in the same direction.
Okay, here's a question from the chat. Is it true that most Jesuits to Asia and globalization phase 1 are from Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy? In globalization phase 2, most of the Jesuits to Asia are from France. My question is, for the Jesuits in different countries, different in their approach to Asian cultures, where the differences, if any, clue due to the phases of globalization or due to the nationalism of Jesuit missionaries from different countries?
This is a very interesting question, because precisely what characterizes the Jesuit China mission is how international it was. Formally, it should be a Portuguese mission. And 1/3 of all the Jesuits in the China mission were Portuguese. Some of them very distinguished, like Tomás Pereira and others who also were great figures. But the majority of them came from countries that had no colonial powers themselves. Italians, Germans, Czechs, Belgian, Poles. If you look at the list of all the most prominent, Italy, because it was a non-colonial power. So the Spanish colonial power wanted to keep its colonies and its Jesuits Spanish. The fury of the Spanish kings came when they realized that most of the Jesuits in Paraguay were not Spanish. They even speak Spanish. They spoke the language of the Guarani, the language of the indigenous people. They never learned Spanish themselves. The Czech, and the Austrians and the North Tyrolean, the North Italian Jesuits in Paraguay. And the same goes for the long list of Chinese Jesuits in the China mission. 2/3 of them were not Portuguese. And certainly only a few were Spanish in Portuguese. So it was very few Spanish in Portuguese missions, very few Portuguese in Spanish missions, but especially in the China mission, in Japan, throughout Asia, the Padroado, Portugal was too small to have enough Jesuit missionaries for all of Asia. And so therefore, it was because the Pope, the obedience to the Father General that could send any of them to missions, and they made sure to send to the mission of China non-Spanish, non-Portuguese. French only came much later, towards the end of the mission with Louis XIV, when he sent the French Jesuit missionaries to Indochina and to because one of the characteristics was the conflict between the three main Catholic powers. Each of them, Portugal, Spain, and France, had their conception of a universal monarchy, wanted to be rulers of the world, competing with one another, each of them becoming a patronate, royal patronage of their own missions, but in conflict with one another. So in Quebec, you only find French Jesuits, right? In Spain, Latin America, mainly Spanish Jesuits, but only in the frontiers you find precisely also Jesuits from other parts of the world. So it's a complex story because the Jesuits were able to, on the one hand, were under the royal patronage of the Catholic kings, but at the same time were under the patronage of the papal authority. And it was in between, they were in between these two powers and gave them the interstitial autonomy to have relatively autonomous global missions that were really, really directed by the Father General from Rome.
In your book about Asia Pacific Catholicism, you know, the Jesuits play a big role, but actually of the authors, some of the very best ones are the Jesuits. However, you have authors here who are Society of Divine Word, Benedictines, Salesians. Peter Fawn is a Salesian, from many different orders. Do you have a sense that their particular approach to contributing to this project and their take on it was different from the Jesuit contributors or not?
Not really from the contributors themselves. Obviously, they didn't like so much. I mean, I remember they didn't want to put so much emphasis upon the Jesuits. This is the first phase. The fact is that when the Jesuits came back to Asia in the second phase of globalization, they abandoned their own principles. There was no more accommodation to indigenous cultures, no more enculturation, no more dialogue with equals. They now were the Romanizers. Now they were truly the papal order that was attacked by the Enlightenment and by liberalism and by nationalism in the 19th century. So, but the 19th century created a lot of new male and female. What characterizes the second phase of globalization is the expansion for the first time of female religious orders. And interestingly, all of them, male and female, all the new orders are copy of the Jesuits. The Jesuit is the first professional missionary order and the first professional educational order. And from now on, every religious order is going to have this dual mission of evangelizing mission and educational mission. To this, you can add other welfare, hospitals, and so on, particularly, but the female religious orders, particularly in the education and the formation of female indigenous religious in Asia. Today, let's say female religious from Korea, from India, and from the Philippines are at the forefront of global Catholic missions. So again, you have this indigenization of the new, and what all the religious orders do is what the Jesuits did. They went there and stayed there for life. They become enculturated. Ritchie was very young when he came to China, and he never left back. He never thought back. He spent the rest of his life as a Chinese. And so this is characteristic of all the new missionaries that basically go to a country and become, if you wish, indigenous members. They go native in the societies in which they become missionaries.
So maybe one final question has to do with controversies within the Catholic Church itself over what this means. Okay. I remember I was at a meeting some years ago, University of San Francisco, is about the rights controversy, and the Jesuits were there, but they had some very heated, I think, passionate arguments with some Dominicans who were there. And very intense. And I thought, wow, it's been 400 years, get over it. But there's a sense of betrayal and so forth.
That is still going on.
And
of course,
so
it reminds me, when I studied in the seminary, my professor of metaphysics was a Dominican. And I still remember that he was attacking Suarez and the Jesuits every day. And so I remember this guy still lives the debates of the 16th, 17th century between Thomas Aquinas and Suarez. So to a certain extent there are, but today I think this is, I don't know, maybe in the US this is the case, but I think that today most of the religious orders really are most of it on the same boat on this. Maybe they disagree about the past and how they interpret their own order. But in terms of the situation today, I don't see that there is a fundamental difference between the mission of the Jesuits and the mission of the Dominicans, at least those I know from Latin America, which I know best. I mean, after all, think of Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, becoming a Dominican himself in old age. So I would joke with him that he joined the Inquisition to be so the Inquisition would protect him from the Vatican Curia. So he joined the Dominican order to be protected from the Vatican Curia. So I mean, the real differences today is what this Pope has tried to do, recognize the internal plurality of Catholicism. Catholicism can only be a Catholic church, global, universal, if it is internally plural. I always said there is room for Franciscans and Dominicans. Before there were the Jesuits, Franciscans and Dominicans were at each other for several centuries. And the Jesuits, and the Jansenists, and Opus Dei, and Comunione Liberazione, and Liberation Theology, and Comunitas San Egidio, all of them, the same way that these 5 last popes are radically different. Each of them presents a different model to a certain of Catholicism. And yet, they're all great popes. I wouldn't say that one is better Catholic than the others. So I think that we are simply have to recognize how complex a global Catholic Church, by definition, have to be. And the question is how to maintain communion with the Bishop of Rome while opening the synodal path of inculturation, of being global and local, being Catholic and Roman at the same time. So Catholic universal and yet also being tied to the Bishop of Rome. This is a serious problem that the more the globe becomes interconnected, and the global culture wars today. There's a lot of conflicts in all the religious traditions internally, and issues of gender, morality, and issues of particular and those issues. And so those issues are unresolved. And I think the Pope is right in thinking that there cannot be a single mode of organization for the Catholic Church. On doctrine, yes, but not on discipline. Discipline, basically, issues which are not linked to the gospel, but that are disciplinary issues that come through traditions historically. I think there is room for complexity, plurality within the church. And this is what the Chinese rites was all about.
Well, we've had a very stimulating hour, and we haven't exhausted all the questions, but I think it's time to give our listeners a chance to absorb all this and to think about it and to think about some other questions going forward. But I think it's time to let you rest and time to close this and allow further reflection and discussion among our audience as time goes on. So Professor Casanova, thank you very, very much for such a
Thank you to all of you. I see Fenggang Yang is among the audience. Hi, Fenggang. Glad that you join us. Good to see you. And thank you to all of you, especially to the US China Catholic Association for the invitation to give this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.